I'm going to start with brief introductions. Julie Morgan is currently a senior advisor in the Office of the Undersecretary at the U.S. Department of Education. Julie most recently served on the Biden-Harris transition team as a member of the COVID-19 response team. Prior to joining the transition, she served in a variety of economic and domestic policy roles, including Vice President of Research at the Roosevelt Institute, Senior Domestic Policy Advisor for Warren for President, and co-founder and executive director of the Great Democracy Initiative. So thank you, Julie, for joining. Scott Giles currently serves as President and Chief Executive Officer of the Vermont Student Assistant Corporation, also known as VSAC. Scott previously served as Deputy Chief of Staff of the Committee on Science of the U.S. House of Representatives and a senior professional staff member on the U.S. Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, the HELP Committee, where he authored the student loan provisions of the Higher Education Act of 1998. A national expert in higher education policy, regulation, and servicing, Scott was designated by Secretary Spellings and Secretary Duncan to represent the nonprofit student loan lenders and servicers in 3 rounds of negotiated rulemaking. Scott has a bachelor's degree from St. Lawrence University and a master's and PhD from the University of Virginia, as well as certificates in finance and management from the Harvard Business School and Kennedy School of Government. Scott, welcome. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Dominique Baker is an assistant professor of education policy at Southern Methodist University. Her research focuses on the way that education policy affects and shapes the access and success of underrepresented students in higher education. Dominique earned her PhD in higher education leadership and policy studies from Peabody College at Vanderbilt University. Prior to pursuing her PhD, Dominique served as an assistant dean in the Office of Undergraduate Admissions at the University of Virginia. So thank you, Dominique, as well for joining. And my first question is actually for you. So the administration has announced that the student loan repayment pause will end in January 2022. Repayment will start for millions of borrowers at the same time. Given your work on this issue, could you share your impressions of what preparations should be made to ensure a smooth transition to repayment, as well as what could possibly go wrong?
Sure. First off, thank you all so much for having me. There are so many things that have to be done. I'm sure for all of you, as soon as you think about the idea of how one prepares for turning back on payments for millions of borrowers, there's tons of things that go through the mind. So I have narrowed down to 2 for this answer, but would love to talk more about other ideas and thoughts as we go throughout the day. So the 2 biggest concerns I think that have to be addressed, number 1, are removing as many administrative burdens as possible. So administrative burdens are the sort of learning costs, time costs, the psychological costs of trying to learn about new policies, learn about new ways of being able to make repayments, figuring out how to get that information to potentially new servicers, because as we'll talk later, right? Some people will have different servicers for their loans. And so as much as possible, removing those pieces and using information that the government already has on borrowers would be incredibly helpful. And so a good example of that is the FSA has a number of connections with other departments and agencies that can help it with understanding information about the other types of social welfare benefits that students are receiving. It could be that potentially a thing that the government does is make it easier or for things like forbearance, other types of deferment, for borrowers based on information that the federal government already has. Therefore, removing or reducing the amount of paperwork that individual borrowers have to complete in order to sort of prove that they need help. I think there are a lot of ways that the federal government has information about folks who need additional financial help, and that the federal government can use that information on the back end instead of forcing people to have to sort of prove themselves, because we know what happens when people are forced to try to prove themselves. The people who might need help the most face the largest roadblocks, and so it makes it more difficult, and then they don't get the help that they deserve. So number 1 is sort of thinking about those burdens and finding ways to sort of automate help to people. And then the second that I'll bring up is that we have to know that for a significant share of people, they have spent time and energy and the money that they saved from not making their payments on other things. We've seen some surveys, right, that point to sort of groceries and other bills that are being paid for with their student loan payment, what they would have been using for their student loan payment. So with that, trying to think, we know that we are going to see an uptick in defaults. That's going to happen. So are there ways to try to think really realistically and strategically about how collections are done, about how the default process is done, in ways to try to help create potentially a buffer for borrowers, particularly if there could be a sort of phased in temporary buffer of a pause on collecting on this type of debt, right? We know we've just seen some announcements about who will be collecting student loan debt, but not quite as much hard and fast information about when collections occur, when they won't occur, those types of things, when things will be reported to the credit reporting bureaus, when they won't. And so I think trying to provide borrowers with a sense that while payments are coming back on, we know it might be difficult for your family to make this transition. And so because of that, we want to find ways to help work with you, because our biggest concern is working with you instead of sort of trying to bleed a stone. So those are the two sort of big things that I'll say. But I think, again, there are a number of things that have to happen, and some, the department's already doing with communicating with borrowers to make sure that they are aware that the repayment is going to turn back on. But I think there are a number of other things that we can discuss, but I want to make sure that my fellow panelists get a chance to chat. So I will put a pause there.
Great, thank you, Dominique. I look forward to exploring those two main points, as well as some of the others that you have yet to bring up in our Q&A portion with our audience, so thank you.
Yeah.
So my next question is for Scott. Scott, from the perspective of loan servicers, what will the restart and repayment look like? How have servicers been preparing? What contact have they had with borrowers thus far? What information have they received from the department? And what are just general concerns that servicers have regarding a smooth transition to repayment?
Sure. And, kind of want to echo something that Dominique said about administrative burdens, and start out actually, by giving a little bit of a shout out to the Department of Education, because there has been a fair amount of work behind the scenes. It's not particularly public and not particularly sexy relative to the kind of the broader conversations about debt cancellation and things of that nature, that I think over time will have a material impact on some of the issues that I think Dominique and I share in common, our concerns about. But so I'm wearing two hats here. We are a former DL servicer. We got out probably 3 years ago. So I've got some perspectives from that. And then we are still a nonprofit that works closely with borrowers in the FEL in our own state loan program. And I thought what I would do is kind of talk a little bit about the things that services are doing, kind of briefly, identify what I'll call some complications that we're worried about, and then make a note that there may be an experience that we had in the past in the program that we can draw on in thinking about how it is that we navigate this with borrowers. And I'll start by saying that the federal servicers, at least those that are kind of remaining within the program, and their staff are eager to get started on all of this. One of the things that I think many people don't realize is that during this pandemic and the pause, many of them furloughed or let staff go during that period of time. So we've got agencies that are preparing for the restart. And one of the challenges that they have in front of them, in addition to everything else, is trying to hire staff in this environment. And these programs are complicated, going back to what Dominique said. I might touch on that later. So training requires 6 to 8 weeks to get somebody up to speed to be able to properly counsel borrowers. And then there's a federal background clearance process that you have to go through to get a new staff person eligible to participate in the contract. So how are they trying to do this? Interestingly, the pandemic and the ability to do remote work has allowed servicers that are remaining in the program to actually hire some of the staff from some of the servicers that are leaving or have recently left, and using those staff remotely so that they can get their staffing up to where they need it to be for when the restart actually takes place. And then from a practical perspective, in addition, the department has authorized the servicers really starting in early fall to begin contact with borrowers again. So communications has been going out, by email. I think Julie will be able to confirm those have been authorized so that, some of the servicers have begun to be able to start making kind of proactive calls out to borrowers to prepare them. And then there have been some changes in the way written communications will take place. There will also be a letter followed up that goes out 10 days before that period, all as part of an effort to catch back up in communication and get back in contact with borrowers. A couple of things I'll just touch on really quickly and then leave it to Julie to fill in. The complications that we are worrying about in the backdrop that we know from experience is that this is a group that is very mobile. And the fact that we have not had contact with them over a 15 to 18 month period means that many of them will no longer be living in the places that we last had their contact information. And the traditional way for skip tracing is to reach out, and those conversations have not been taking place. So servicers have been trying to do some creative work over the course of the last several months using other vendors to try and identify the most current addresses and contact information for borrowers. But that'll clearly be a complicating factor, all of this, kind of when we start. And then the last two things that I'll just kind of touch on, and I think we'll come back to, is that, you mentioned that there will be transfers taking place. The timing of these transfer when borrowers are not in a payment status. The fact that we may be doing these transfers early in a restart process is just a complication that we'll need to, I think, work together to think through. And then my last observation is kind of a historical one, and it touches a little bit on what Dominique said about collections. When we got into the DL servicing program, we VSAC, we inherited accounts from ACS that had not been well serviced, and many borrowers had not made payments in over 10 years. And the task that we were given collectively by the department was to work with those borrowers. And together we learned some really creative things about using social marketing and social norming tools rather than traditional collection tools for reconnecting with borrowers who are most at risk. And I think that there are some opportunities for us to learn from that experience and apply some of those tools to working with borrowers in this new environment. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Scott. I appreciate hearing some of the intersections. It's all relating between Dominique's thoughts from borrowers, Scott's thoughts on servicers, and I'm sure Julie will have some more thoughts kind of intersecting between all of those. Before I get to Julie, I do just want to remind everyone that when we get to audience Q&A, I see that I froze, so I'll start over, sorry. I see that when we get to Q&A, you'll have two options for asking your questions. You'll be able to virtually raise your hand, or you will be able to submit questions via Slido. Irene will be sharing that link in the chat, but Slido is a forum where you can submit questions and upvote questions that you would like us to ask our panelists. So I'd encourage you to submit those questions while our panelists are speaking. But now, Julie, question for you. We've heard both from Scott and Dominique about what servicers are doing to prepare for the restart, how students might experience the transition. Could you share with us a bit about the department's plan to roll out the restart? How does the department plan to let borrowers know repayment is restarting? What steps has the department already taken? And what red flags will the department be looking out before and after the rollout to ensure that students don't immediately slide back into default or other adverse federal student loan statuses?
Sure, it's a big question. Thanks. I want to say, first of all, thank you for having me here, because I think this is a topic that is on our mind every day, and it's really helpful. Dominique and Scott raised a lot of the challenges that we think that borrowers are going to encounter and that servicers are encountering or may encounter that are going to make this more challenging for borrowers. And we're trying to, identify those and address as many of them as we can on the front end so that they're not harming borrowers in the back end. And And I think, as you all know, this is a totally unprecedented challenge. We've never had all of the student loans in a pause that has not been consistent, right? It has been supposed to end and then extended several times. And I think that that's something just to keep in the back of our minds. I think speaks to what Scott was saying about the staffing for the servicers. Is part of the reason why we want to be clear that this is the final extension of the pause, is that we need something for both the servicers and for the borrowers to be able to plan around, because there have been these kind of fits and starts here. But it's an unprecedented challenge. And so we are preparing for it as best we can. And I think as McGregor was saying, the rollout of the plan, and in the back of my mind, I was saying, well, it's already kind of underway, because we are already communicating, and servicers are already communicating with borrowers here. But let me just give you a little bit about how the department is thinking about this. So, I think one thing to note here is that not all student loan borrowers are the same. And that is an acute challenge here with turning the loan payments back on. We have about 35 million borrowers who have to transition back into repayment. But they don't all need the same kind of support from the government, and they don't all need exactly the same message from us either. So, we have some borrowers who were kind of steadily repaying their loans before the pandemic and are poised to steadily start again afterward, as long as they're aware of when their payments will start. There are other people who were steadily paying up until March 2020, whose financial circumstances have changed and, may not be in the same position to make a payment or a payment at the same amount. Obviously there were a lot of borrowers who are already delinquent or in default before the pause. And those are borrowers who need some care and attention as we transition back in, because it does give them, in a sense, a chance to get back on a path if we can give them the supports that they need. Another group that I think about a lot is borrowers who left school and were in a grace period. These are people who were in a type of pause and then transitioned out into this kind of broader COVID pause and may not even realize the distinction between those two things. So there are some real, substantive challenges for people who can't make their payments, mixed in with communications challenges for people who, may just not realize what is going on, because this isn't always top of mind for people. And I think, to Dominique's point, trying to minimize the amount that people have to learn about the student loan program in order to make their student loan payment is a really, really important goal here. So, we're working to try to ensure that we're helping all borrowers transition back into repayment. But we have a particular focus on borrowers who are at the highest risk to either, need some help or need some additional communications to avoid delinquency or default. And we're trying to think about this through all of the different levers that the Department of Education has at its disposal. I think that two that I would focus on today are our own kind of voice in the conversation, and then the role of the servicers. So, we know the Department of Education through FSA has the ability to communicate directly with borrowers. We also have kind of like a broader voice through our larger communications efforts. And so we're trying to leverage those as best we can. FSA has already launched its communications with borrowers on return to repayment, including monthly emails. And these are direct emails to borrowers. They're segmented by different borrower attributes. And they are focused right now on kind of general awareness, but also encouraging borrowers to take the steps that they can right now to get themselves set up for being able to transition into repayment. So, that might be ensuring that they have that their servicer has up-to-date contact information for them, informing them about the ability to enroll in auto debit so that they can be sure that they won't miss that first payment, or, encouraging borrowers to enroll in an income-driven repayment plan, or kind of otherwise use the resources the department has available to think about what's the right repayment plan for them. And then, we've got other kinds of communications that the department can do directly, including social media and paid media, and we're using those as well here. And then we're working with the servicers who are a main point of contact for borrowers. So we're working to make sure that they are able to have the adequate call center hours and staffing on hand to be able to answer borrower questions. I think that will be really critical as we get even closer to the actual return to repayment. And then we're working to have them, I mean, they want to do this anyway, but to make sure that we have outreach efforts from the servicers that complement the Department of Education's own efforts, and to target communications to at-risk borrowers. And I think, you know, one of the things that has been in the back of my mind through all of this is that this transition back into repayment is somewhat fluid. It's not a single date, right? So we have to think about this from not only when is it convenient for us to send communications, but when borrowers actually need that communication. And it may not be until the day before, right? So, you know, some people are going to know about this and plan for it early, but some people are going to need the communications either right when their payment is due or sometime afterward. And we should use the levers that we have to kind of make sure that we're ready for that. We're communicating with them when they need it. And then also that we are, you know, thinking broadly about how we can use the, you know, both kind of like the tools and the policy supports that we have to make sure that some of the kind of unforeseen stumbling blocks, like hiring problems or other kind of barriers that are outside of our control, don't harm borrowers in the process. So that's kind of the way that we're looking at this overall. I think, as Dominique pointed out, there's like 10,000 different ways to look at this issue. So happy to take some questions.
Well, thank you for that. Let's go ahead and open our Q&A to our alumni. You can ask questions in one of two ways. You can virtually raise your hand and I will call on you. I do ask that you virtually raise your hand because there are more of you than I can fit on my screen. And you can do virtually raise your hand by clicking on your reactions button at the bottom of your screen and then the raise hand option. I would also encourage you, if you feel comfortable, to turn your camera on so we can interact with you all that way. You can also submit your questions via Slido, and Irene has put the link into the chat. So the first question that I have, I see a couple of virtual hands and I will come to those after this question. This first question I have dovetails nicely with really all three of our panelists' responses regarding, you know, different types of borrowers and how borrowers are in different circumstances when they're restarting their payment. Julie talked about, you know, borrowers who are in different loan statuses at the beginning of the pause, and concerns about those statuses restarting. But I wanted to focus on different loan types. So grad plus borrowers, FFEL borrowers, direct loan, undergraduate direct loan, subsidized, unsubsidized, as well as parent plus. Have any of those borrowers been either adversely or more positively affected by the pause? And could you share specifically concerns about those borrowers restarting or certain you know, communications plans targeted towards those borrowers from either the department or from servicers? And I'm going to start with Dominique, then I'll go to Scott and then Julie for response on this question.
Okay, so I think, so I think I would assume, I guess, I would say, we do not have very good research on this yet, right? So a lot of this is very educated guesswork. That's what I like to think of it, but I want to be really upfront about that. I would assume that folks that we want to make sure we are paying particular attention to when it comes to types of loans, I think we are reaching a point where the people who have parent plus loans are frequently also people who have loans themselves for their own education. And so a thing that I don't think we always think about or talk about maybe is sort of the multiplier effect for people with parent plus loans, and the reality that for a number of them, right, like we've started to see some surveys from AARP from before the pandemic, looking at the number of older adults who have taken out loans and what that's doing, particularly to things like their Social Security garnishment. And so I do think that there is an opportunity that people with Parent Plus loans, especially because we know, right, Parent Plus can be up to the full cost of attendance. So these can be quite large loans, that there is some concern there for people. I think, right, we typically think of, for very good reasons, thinking about folks who also like did not complete a credential, who have exited higher education without a credential because of the realities of whether or not their payments will be manageable for their student loans. But if we're talking specifically about types of loans, I'm always sort of interested in the folks who have Parent Plus loans, especially just because I don't think our systems have a really good time of talking to each other when it comes to student loans. And we don't all have the ability to like shut down the systems that we can actually look at the National Student Loan Data System, because it's so massive, right? That it is not a very nimble system to be able to look and connect those pieces for folks. So yeah, that's what I would say when it comes to student loan types.
Thank you. Scott, do you have any thoughts you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think maybe echoing a little bit of what Dominique was responding to. As I kind of think about this question, I probably focus less on the loan type than some other kind of dynamics. So, the first group, the three groups that I'm worried about right in the beginning are those who, separated during the pandemic, without receiving a credential or degree, those that borrowed in order to attend a proprietary school, and this is challenging for a different way, those that borrowed in order to go to a community college, because we know just historically from the data that even under the best of circumstances, those borrowers are going to struggle. And now we've just layered this, over the top. And then going back to something that Julie was saying about how we need to disaggregate our communications and our messages. Dominique already touched on the Parent Plus, but I'll talk maybe about Grad Plus, which is an interesting one because folks with more education did, relatively speaking, better in the pandemic than people with less education. So that those are not necessarily the folks that are at the greatest risk for default under, from a conventional perspective. But because of the size of those balances and the amount of cash flow that was generated by the pause, they are also the group that's most likely to have made other life choices during this period of time to take advantage of the free cash flow that they had. And we are now going to be working with that group in reentry into figuring out how it is that they balance, the variety of choices that they may or may not have made. And I think this goes back to Julie's point that each group is going to require being thought about differently and communicated with differently and then supported differently.
Great, thank you. Julie, anything that you'd like to add?
Well, I think the thing that comes to mind for me when we think about different loan type is a little bit less about how they were affected by the pandemic and more about the different, that the programs and services that are available sometimes vary by loan type. People's interest rate varies by loan type. The non-defaulted FEL loans were not in the pause like the other loans were. And there's a lot of borrowers who have multiple loan types. So in my experience working with borrowers, a lot of borrowers don't know which type of loan they have. These distinctions that are very clear to us because we talk about it all day are like totally opaque to people who are trying to repay their loans. So I think it makes the challenge particularly hard around advising borrowers about what to do if they can't make a payment or if they want to take advantage of programs that are available to them, like public service loan forgiveness and other things. So it's a real challenge for servicers. I think we have to find the best ways we can to make things simpler, and some of that are things that we can think about with relationship to the pause, and then some of those things have to be longer term goals. So.
Great, thank you. Well, I am told that we have a very lively Slido chat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Nathan. Arnold, I see he has his hand up. I'm going to go to Slido for a question, and then I will come back to Caitlin for a question. So Nathan, I just lost you on my screen, but if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question, please feel free.
Yeah, thanks, McGregor, and really appreciate the speakers and the information y'all are providing. My question is about the flexibilities that Dominique was referring to post restart of the payment pause. I think what has been released through that Politico FOIA about some of the flexibilities you all are thinking about was really elegant, and I'm really glad to see you all thinking about that way. I'm wondering, I think my question is about the legal authority of the department to execute against those flexibilities and the policy implications of perhaps choosing when and how to discontinue those flexibilities. So I guess I'm wondering, typically to place a borrower in a deferment, you have to get the borrower's assent to do so. And so I'm sort of wondering what the department is thinking about, especially if the president ends the national declaration of emergency and it puts a stop to, the HEROES waiver authorities, what you all see in terms of your flexibilities to be able to continue offering those flexibilities to borrowers. And then I think to Julie and Dominique, how would you go about deciding when and how to stop extending those flexibilities? Does that continue for 6 months, as a year? When a borrower just simply isn't repaying or you can't find them, how does that transition back to normalcy look?
I'm happy to take a crack at some of that. I won't go too deeply into what our legal authorities are here, but it has, based on the conversations that we've had, our legal authorities haven't been a barrier here. And as you noted, we do have some additional legal authority here under the HEROES Act because we are in a national emergency. And I think, this question of when to end flexibilities is a good one. I think the best thing that, the way that I have been thinking about this is, we try to make our best guesses about these things as based on what we know about what borrowers are experiencing now or what we think they're going to experience, but we're going to have to track the data really closely as this goes. I think there are, hopefully there are no unforeseen consequences, but, the magnitude of different consequences, I think will kind of depend on how things play out. And we'll just have to keep an eye on that and figure out whether we need to take additional actions as we go.
Yeah, I'll just throw in, I think that makes a ton of sense. The things I've been trying to think about are are there sort of parts of the macroeconomic system that we might think, or indicators that might say that it feels like we could reassess whether or not we need these flexibilities anymore? Is that the unemployment rate? Is that what are those pieces? So I've been trying to think about that a little bit, and most right, they have pluses and minuses of using different measures. I think especially when it comes to thinking about some of these issues, we were talking about loan types earlier, but if we talk about groups of students, one of the groups of students I'm most concerned about are Black students. Not because there's something innately wrong with Black students, but because our systems are such that Black students rely on student loans to attend college at a much higher rate and then enter a labor market that discriminates against them and pays them less for the same degrees as their peers. And so with those types of pieces, right, if we just do a blanket unemployment rate, we know that Black unemployment is higher than the overall unemployment rate. And so it may not be the exact measure of when flexibilities need to to have. I do think it makes sense to tie it to the data, right? So FSA has a lot of data. Through some collaborations, right? Treasury has a fair amount of data that could potentially be made available to FSA and the Department of Education. And I think being data-driven about this makes sense, but I completely understand it's really difficult to make a decision about which data points determine that we are at the point that these flexibilities can go away.
Really helpful. Thank you both.
I can just piggyback on that, and just now what I'm going to say is going to go the opposite direction of what I said about the importance of simplicity. But the two things that I think about from a state policy perspective where we wrestle with some of these same questions is partially what I think both Julie and Dominique said, that not all borrowers are the same, and not all of the accommodations that we're offering have the same impact for all borrowers. And so to the degree that we can be targeted in our thinking about this, broad population, when we offer a broad accommodation to everybody, that whose primary benefit would be for a subset. So I would be encouraging us to try and think that way insofar as we can. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you all. So I'm going to go over to our lively Slido chat, then Caitlin, I will come to you. I'm going to group together a couple questions from Slido because they are all related to the same topic. And I'm going to direct this first to Scott, then Julie, and then Dominique. Would love your thoughts. So Scott, earlier you talked about social norming activities that can be done by servicers to reach borrowers. Could you talk a little bit about what those were? And then I also want to talk more specifically about some of those communications. Do we know the percentage of borrowers that are actually opening their emails that they receive regarding restart information from the department or for their servicers? And then regarding that communication, how much autonomy do servicers have to communicate with borrowers outside of those communications from the department? And
Great, and
Scott, Julie, and then Dominique would love thoughts.
Sure, and I think I may have to lean into Julie a little bit on this because some of these rules have changed a little bit. Part of what we did was we decided that we were going to treat these borrowers not through a collections lens, but through a marketing lens. And think about the tools that marketers have developed over time in order to be able to effectively get people's attention and to get them to open emails and to kind of pay attention and respond. And so the messages were really positive and supportive. In some cases, one of our most winning ones was, and these were with borrowers that had not made payments in 10 years, is, this past month, we helped, 100 people just like you. And our open rate in those went up to 35 or 40% for an audience that had not been responding to any communications from anyone. And I've done our marketing team a disservice in terms of what the real tagline was, but I think you get the idea that we were able to, by positive messaging and using some social norming techniques, we got high response rates. And then once we made contact, we were able to kind of help almost every borrower in that particular group. And there's a lot of experience in that. And the department, I think, subsequent to that was developing its own internal team for trying to develop, model, and do A/B testing, which is, kind of what we all did. The challenge from a timing perspective for the servicers is understandably the department wants to approve every communication that the servicers send out. So there's always a time lag as you're trying to map out a campaign like this, working back and forth with the department, to get that done. But just because there's a time lag doesn't mean that those models can't be actually very, very effective.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I think we do track the open rates on emails closely. I think, but in thinking about the open rates on emails right now, I go back to that thing of like, not everyone needs the communication today. It's just sometimes it is important for us to continue sending the same kinds of communications to borrowers over time because their openness and desire for the information is going to change as we get closer or as they realize that we're getting closer to their return to repayment. But I think, we have been thinking about how to message really simply to borrowers, being careful about the, kind of like the grade level of the communications that we're sending to borrowers, that we're not overly filled with jargon, and that we're more direct. The language is less the language that we use to talk about federal financial aid programs and more the language that borrowers use to talk about, their ability to repay. And then, I think we've also been thinking and working with the servicers on things like, sending messages where you don't have to click through to something else to see the message, that the message is right there in the email, because I think that's a really helpful feature as well.
Yeah, okay. So what I'll throw in very quickly is just that I think a thing that people are doing that's very helpful and that we have to keep doing is thinking holistically about the types of messages that people receive, right? It's not just about this one message this one time, but thinking about an entire pattern of how we communicate with borrowers and how we engage with them. I think there are several pieces that we can learn from sort of the more recent research on was referred to behavioral nudges, both their successes and their challenges and setbacks in current research. That there are ways that we can sort of help create defaults and structure defaults in such a way, and by that I don't mean student loan defaults, right? Like what the default decision is in order to help folks, but that also at a certain point, that type of nudge information is not enough. Right. If the challenge is too large, then regardless of how many nudging texts or emails that you send, it's not actually going to get the behavior that you're interested in inducing. So we have to think about this sort of complex system, which it sounds like folks are doing.
Great, thank you. I want to now shift over to Caitlin, who has very patiently had her hand raised. So thank you. I do also just want to say these questions are great, and I'm sorry we have limited time, but I want to encourage you to reach out to our panelists whose contact information you will get in the Dropbox you receive next week. So Caitlin, if you would like to unmute and ask your question.
Sure. So I think this is in direct response to the remark Julie had about folks in default and delinquency being particular communities that, need a lot of outreach going into repayment. And I guess I was hoping to follow up on the coverage from last month about Operation Fresh Start and giving folks who are in default a path towards repayment, not just because a lot of my faculty members have raised the question, but certainly like I have a lot of friends that are in default who want to have that clarity going into February. So wondering if there's any updates on that and like what the advocacy community can do to help get clarity on that particular community.
I actually would love to hear what the other panelists have to think, and then I'll follow on. But I would just love to hear what you guys are thinking about defaulted borrowers as well.
Scott, I think you're muted.
I was wondering, Dominique, you want to go first?
Sure. Okay. So I'll keep it brief. I think there are several very good evidence-based reasons that anyone who was in default before the pause should just be considered to sort of have the slate wiped clean and that we sort of start anew. So yeah, I think that would also be particularly which the current administration in part did eventually run part of the campaign on canceling a portion of student loan debt. And that has not currently come to fruition. And so I do think that from a political standpoint, since that does not appear that that's going to happen at the same time that payments are going to get started, you would like to probably try to get some sort of win or a boon to people who have been struggling with their debt, right? If we want to be targeted and we're thinking about how do we have already like information about people who are struggling with debt, folks who were in default before the pause are probably people who are struggling with their student loan debt. And so that could be one way to try and make a more clear concession for those people who might be struggling in that way.
And I think that, part of what we've been thinking about kind of from the counseling and the outside with this is that providing these borrowers with an opportunity, through whether it's rehab or another path, towards getting a fresh start is in everybody's best interest. And to the degree that we can quickly get them into IDR without the administrative burden, if we can move them quickly into IDR, every one of them should be in an IDR program, probably by default. if we can find a way to do that fairly easily. And I know the department is actually looking at some things in order to protect those borrowers that were in IDR plans beforehand by extending that period of time and creating I believe the authority to be able to do verbal confirmation of income for purposes of getting people into an IDR plan fairly quickly. So I think, my view would be that this is a great population for us to focus on trying to get into IDR as just rapidly as we can.
Yeah, it's really helpful to hear others give their thoughts on this topic. It's definitely a tough one. We want to be able to put borrowers who are in default on the best path that we can. And so, I don't have any updates on where we are on that. It's still under discussion, but definitely a population of borrowers that we really want to give some additional attention.
And one group that I didn't mention in here is that we are looking at the same thing in the FIL program. That's, I think Julie didn't mention it, but, our work as a guarantor with the department, those borrowers who defaulted during the pandemic are essentially going to be given the interest-free pause. Any mandatory payments were going to be returned to them. Effectively, we're going to clean the slate for them, and then they will be assigned to the department, really just as a path of getting them into one of the more robust kind of IDR plans over at the department. So this is work that's going on within both programs.
Great, thank you all. We're running towards the end of our session, but I would be remiss if I did not ask a question to our panelists about the imminent departures of the Pennsylvania Higher Education Assistance Agency, FIA, and Granite State, two of the direct student loan servicers who've announced that they will be leaving the direct loan servicing program come the end of this year. So real quick, I have about 2 minutes. Scott, Dominique, Julie, if you have any thoughts on what their departures will mean for borrowers, how will borrowers who have been assigned, who are currently with these servicers, how will they be transferred to other servicers? And are there any concerns about what will happen, particularly for borrowers who are enrolled in the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program?
If I can jump in and just make a structural observation and then leave conversation about the transfer, to others. I think that the reason that many servicers have left the program is because there's a structural problem in the compensation. That means the margins are so low for the way the program is designed. So the department is actually paying what is below market rates for servicing relative to what you would pay commercially for private loan or for the FIL program, for a program that is significantly more complicated to kind of service and administer. And as I've said before, because of the complexity of the program, for many borrowers, we need a counseling program system, not a servicing system. And yet we're paying for a servicing system, and that creates challenges for nonprofits like my organization who were in it as counseling groups. We just couldn't afford to continue to be able to do that. And I think that the departure is more a sign of that structural challenge than people are attending to. And my last pitch to folks in Congress is the solution to this in part is to simplify the program.
Yeah, so the loan transfers are a bit of a complicating factor here that we have to think about as we think about return to repayment. One of the ways that we're addressing that is by doing as many loan transfers as we reasonably can before the loans come back into repayment. So we're transferring millions of loans before December of 2021, and then are likely to take a pause in those transfers for a period of time to focus on the return to repayment and not overly complicate things for borrowers. And then resume. And we're communicating with borrowers as we go who are affected by this. So in some cases, like what happens immediately after a servicer announces that they're leaving the program is that we post information publicly for borrowers, but we also communicate directly with those borrowers. And so we are both communicating with them about the transfers and then integrating that information into the communications around return to repayment. So they're kind of getting both of the pieces that are relevant to them at the same time. But it's transfers are always require a lot of care and attention to make sure that they're done in a way that doesn't harm borrowers, or either, you know, kind of through the technical transfer or through borrowers' awareness of the fact that it's happening. And so, you know, our timeline for transferring the borrowers is based on that. It's kind of based on the necessary testing and oversight that we think we need to do to make sure that we're able to resolve any issues as they arise. So that's kind of the general situation there.
Dominique, any thoughts to share? No, okay. Well, thank you all of our panelists for those remarkably honest and thoughtful responses. And thank you to all of our participants for your thoughtful questions. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to get to all of our virtual raised hands or all of the questions on the Slido, but we are running to the end of our session. And before we close, I want to ask each of our panelists a final question to get their final thought that they want you to leave with from this session. So we can go Dominique, Julie, and Scott, if you have a 30-second final food for thought or statement you would like to reiterate with our audience before we end the session.
Sure. Again, thanks so much for coming out and listening. I would say my biggest thing, right, is like, we all know this is incredibly complex with moving parts, several groups and organizations that have a role to play. We haven't really even touched on the role that institutions have to play, right, when we think about borrowers. So there's just all sorts of moving pieces to this. And so I think the biggest things that we should always be trying to think about who is the most vulnerable to being taken advantage of or to having like long-term harms. And then what can we do to try to protect those folks?
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just say, you know, I really appreciate the chance to be here and talk about this with you all, and just would leave with like a general call for, if if you have additional thoughts about this topic, we would definitely love to hear them. We have been, working for several months now to, basically since we came in January, to think about return to repayment and prepare for this. And a lot of the work that we've done has been informed by experts who kind of live this every day and understand the experiences of borrowers from a different perspective than what we can get from, say, like internal data, so which is also very important. But your perspectives are always welcome. So appreciate the chance.
Great, thank you. And I've enjoyed the opportunity to kind of engage with this panel as well. I think my final closing observation would be that maybe it leans a little bit into something Dominique was leaning into, and that's that we too often think of our programs in silos. And my organization is the grant making organization, it's the TRIO organization, it's the Gear Up organization, and then we're involved in lending. And all of these conversations with borrowers, all borrowers in this environment are looking for trusted voices. And to the degree that we can break down our silos and take advantage of the trusted voices that are part of all of our programs to reach out to folks, I think we can probably achieve more. And I think there's an opportunity at the department level, and then there's an opportunity at the state level as well for entities like mine to leverage those relationships and support borrowers.
Well, thank you, panelists. Thank you, Dominique, Julie, and Scott for your participation, and again, to all of our audience for questions.